Here's what's strange about the sharpest minds. They almost never look sharp from the outside. Often the quieter someone seems, the more is happening underneath. Let me show you what the research actually finds. Because we've been taught to spot intelligence by its noise. The fast talker. The confident answer. The person who raises their hand first. But that isn't where the real thinking usually lives. The real thinking tends to sit in the pause, in the person who waits half a beat longer before speaking, in the eyes that track the room before the mouth ever opens, in the friend who says less at dinner, then texts you 3 days later with the one sentence that reframes your whole week. Psychologists have been circling this pattern for decades, and what they keep finding is almost the opposite of the stereotype. Sharp minds are usually quiet minds, not because they have less to say, but because they have more to sort through. There is simply more happening between the stimulus and the response. So today I want to walk you through the quiet psychology of an unusually sharp mind, the traits that almost never get named out loud, but that anyone who has one will recognize instantly. And by the end, you'll know whether this is describing someone you love or, quietly, you. The first thing you'll notice about a sharp mind is that it takes longer to answer, not shorter. Researchers who study cognitive processing call this reflective thinking, and it's the opposite of the impulsive style our culture keeps rewarding. The reflective thinker is running a second pass. They hear your question, and instead of grabbing the first available answer, they scan the shelf behind it. From the outside, that pause looks like slowness or shyness or even uncertainty. People sometimes rush to fill it, assuming the sharp person doesn't know. But what's actually happening is closer to editing. They're not searching for an answer. They're choosing between 3 of them. And the one they finally give you is usually the one you remember weeks later. That's the tell. Speed sounds impressive in the moment. Precision echoes, which leads to something even less obvious about how these minds handle being wrong. Sharp minds are strangely comfortable saying, "Well, I don't know." Most people treat those 3 words as a small defeat. The unusually intelligent treat them as a starting line. This is tied to what psychologists sometimes call intellectual humility, the ability to hold your own opinion loosely enough to update it. Research on this trait keeps linking it to better reasoning, better learning, and more accurate self-assessment. The mechanism is almost boring once you see it. If your ego is fused to being right, every new piece of information becomes a threat. If your ego is fused to understanding, every new piece of information becomes fuel. From the outside, "I don't know" can sound like a lack of confidence. It's usually the opposite. It takes a very secure mind to admit a gap in public. And once you notice this in someone, you start noticing it everywhere, including in how they listen. Which brings us to a trait that gets misread almost every single time. Sharp minds listen like they're recording, not waiting. Most conversations are 2 people taking turns rehearsing their next sentence. A sharp mind quietly steps out of that game. They watch your face. They track the small contradiction between what you said and how you said it. They notice the word you almost used and then swapped out. Psychologists studying social cognition sometimes call this thin slicing, the brain's ability to pick up an enormous amount of information from tiny behavioral cues in seconds. The mechanism is that attention is a finite resource, and sharp minds spend it outward instead of inward. They aren't performing during the conversation, they're gathering. From the outside, this looks like being reserved, maybe even a little intense. It's usually the exact opposite of disengagement. It's someone taking you seriously enough to actually hear you. And the moment you feel truly heard by one of these people, you understand why they're often the friend everyone secretly relies on. But there's a trait underneath the listening that's even rarer. Sharp minds notice patterns before they notice people. This is one of the most consistent findings in the psychology of higher cognitive ability, a hunger for structure, for the shape underneath the noise. They'll be sitting through a meeting, and instead of tracking who said what, they're tracking why the same argument keeps looping. They'll be at a family dinner and quietly clocking that the same 3 sentences have started the same 3 fights for 20 years. The mechanism here is something researchers describe as cognitive flexibility, the mind's ability to shift levels, to zoom out from the immediate content and see the framework it's sitting inside. From the outside, this can look like detachment. Sometimes people accuse them of overthinking or being in their head. But what's really happening is that they're not stuck on the surface with everyone else. They're one level up, watching the machinery move. And that same instinct to look one level up is what makes them handle their own emotions very differently from most people. Sharp minds tend to feel things deeply and describe them precisely. There's a concept in emotional research called emotional granularity. The ability to distinguish, say, disappointment from resentment from quiet grief, instead of blending them all into bad. People with high emotional granularity aren't more sensitive in a fragile way. They're more sensitive in a resolved way. They can name what's happening inside them, which means they can actually do something about it. The mechanism is almost linguistic. The more specific your inner vocabulary, the more accurately your brain can respond to what you're feeling. Vague feelings run you. Precise feelings you can work with. From the outside, this can look like being too much or too intense. From the inside, it's just clarity. And that same appetite for precision is why the sharp mind is often quietly obsessed with a very unfashionable thing, being wrong. Sharp minds actively look for the flaw in their own thinking. It's a habit so rare that when you see it, you almost don't trust it at first. This ties directly to research on the Dunning-Kruger effect, which most people know as unskilled people overrate themselves. But the more interesting half of that same finding is the flip side. Genuinely skilled people tend to underrate themselves because they can see all the ways they could still be wrong. The mechanism is that expertise sharpens your view of your own gaps. The more you know about a subject, the more clearly you can see the edges of what you don't know. From the outside, this looks like insecurity or modesty. It's neither, it's calibration. And this quiet calibration bleeds into something you can feel in the room with them even before they speak. Sharp minds carry an unusually still kind of presence. Not cold, still. There's less nervous movement, less filler talk, less performing. Part of this is what psychologists studying self-regulation would call low reactivity. The stimulus comes in, but instead of a big splash, there's a small ripple, because so much of the response is happening internally rather than externally. The mechanism is that a well-trained attention system doesn't have to broadcast every thought. It can hold a lot without needing to spill it. From the outside, that stillness can be mistaken for aloofness or even arrogance. In reality, it's usually the sign of someone who has learned that not every thought needs an audience. And that same restraint shows up in one of the most misunderstood traits on this list. Sharp minds are very slow to form strong opinions, and very hard to move once they do. Most people are the opposite. Quick to decide, easy to sway, because their positions were never really theirs to begin with. This is connected to what psychologists sometimes call need for cognition, a genuine enjoyment of effortful thinking. People high in this trait don't want the prepackaged answer. They want to build the answer themselves. The mechanism is simple. An opinion you constructed brick by brick is much harder to knock down than one you borrowed. You know where every joint is because you put them there. From the outside, this can look like stubbornness or being difficult. But watch closely and you'll see it isn't rigidity. It's ownership. They'll change their mind the moment the evidence changes, just not the moment the mood in the room changes. And that resistance to social pressure sets up the next trait, which is probably the one people underestimate the most. Sharp minds are quietly comfortable being alone with their own mind. This is not the same as being lonely, and it's not the same as being antisocial. It's something subtler, an ability to sit inside their own head without needing to escape it. Research on solitude keeps finding the same thing. People who can tolerate and even enjoy unstructured time alone tend to score higher on creativity, self-awareness, and long-term life satisfaction. The mechanism is that a mind that isn't constantly being fed external stimulation starts making its own connections. Ideas cross-pollinate in the quiet. Insights arrive in the shower, on the walk, in the space that most people fill with a screen. From the outside, this can look like being a loner or being in your own world, which is technically true. It just happens to be a world with a lot going on. And that inner world is where the next trait quietly develops. Sharp minds are drawn to complexity and slightly bored by simplicity, not in an arrogant way, in the way a musician is drawn to a difficult piece. The concept underneath this is sometimes called openness to experience, one of the most consistently studied traits in personality psychology. It correlates strongly with intelligence, creativity, and a lifelong hunger for learning. The mechanism is dopamine. A brain that's used to solving hard problems has calibrated its reward system to enjoy the climb, not just the summit. Easy answers feel a little flat, the way a familiar song feels on the 10th listen. From the outside, this can be mistaken for restlessness or never being satisfied. From the inside, it's just the natural pull of a mind that's genuinely awake. And an awake mind tends to do one more thing that almost nobody talks about. Sharp minds hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. Most people can't tolerate two opposing ideas at once. They collapse the tension by picking a side. Psychologists sometimes describe this capacity as integrative complexity, the ability to see multiple valid perspectives on the same issue and hold them all at the same time. The mechanism is that reality is almost never one thing. People are both kind and selfish. Situations are both good and bad. A sharp mind has stopped pretending otherwise and started thinking in shades instead of switches. From the outside, this can look like being non-committal or sitting on the fence. In reality, it's the opposite of intellectual laziness. It's someone refusing to pretend the world is simpler than it is. And once you see that refusal, you start noticing something else about them. Sharp minds are unusually kind in a very specific way. They're kind on purpose. Not performative kindness, not the let me be seen being nice kind. Quiet, deliberate, considered kindness. Because when you can read a room this well, you also see who's tired, who's shrinking, who just got a piece of hard news and hasn't said anything, and a mind that notices that much has to decide what to do with what it sees. Research on emotional intelligence keeps landing here. The sharpest cognitive minds and the most emotionally aware minds overlap far more than pop culture suggests. The stereotype of the cold genius is mostly a myth. From the outside, their kindness can look understated, a well-timed message, a thoughtful question, a quiet moment of protection when someone's about to embarrass themselves. But that's the thing about a sharp mind. It doesn't need to be loud to be felt. And when you stack all of this together, a picture starts forming that's very different from the one we grew up with. What's interesting is how consistently these traits get misread. The pause looks like slowness. The listening looks like distance. The precision looks like intensity. The solitude looks like sadness. The complexity looks like indecision. Almost every hallmark of a sharp mind can be mistaken for a weakness by someone who isn't looking closely. Which is why so many unusually intelligent people spend years quietly wondering if something is wrong with them, before realizing they were simply built to run a different program. If you recognize yourself in more than a few of these, that recognition itself is data. The people who match this profile almost never brag about matching it. They read the description, feel a small, quiet click, and then keep it to themselves. So I'm curious, which one of these landed the hardest for you? Which one felt less like a description and more like a mirror? Tell me in the comments. I actually read them, and the patterns in your replies often become the next video. If this is the kind of psychology you want more of, there's another one on this channel about the quiet habits of people who think more than they speak. It pairs with this one almost perfectly. And if you want to keep going deeper, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. I decode one hidden pattern of the mind each week, and the next one is about a trait that's even more misread than any of these. Because in the end, the sharpest minds were never the loudest ones in the room. They were the ones who understood the room while everyone else was still trying to be seen in it. And once you learn to spot that, you start seeing it everywhere. Sharpness was never the noise. It was always the quiet underneath it.